Good evening. I'm Anne Flaherty, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome you to the Irish Cultural Centre's Digital Literary Festival. The Centre is based in Hammersmith, London, and for the past 25 years has delivered to its patrons the most diverse Irish cultural and educational programme outside Ireland. The festival comprises a series of interviews featuring some of the most successful authors in contemporary Irish writing. They will be discussing, and some of them will also be reading from their recent publications. My interview this evening is with the award-winning novelist, playwright, poet, Dermot Bolger, and we'll be discussing his new collection of short stories, Secrets Never Told, which is published this month. Dermot, you're very, very welcome to our festival and delighted that you're able to talk to us. Now, in saying that it's a new book or a new collection, in actual fact, they're not new stories, isn't that right, Dermot? Some of them have been, most of them in fact, have been broadcast or published in anthologies or, you know, even appeared in plays down through the years. What was it that made you bring them all together in their original length?
We haven't did. I'm going to hold up the real cover now because that was the proof copy. So we actually blood was spilled. I'm got a new cover, lovely cover. The odd thing with some of these short stories go back 20 years. Most of them are more recent, and the thing is that Samuel Johnson said that the only reason to write is anybody who wrote without getting paid was a blockhead, which was a bit extreme. But Sammy Cahn, the American songwriter, was once asked what came first, the music or the lyrics, and he said the phone call. And so many of these were stories that were in my head. Many of these were based on events or little sort of things that would make a fascinating story. But in some ways, writers prevaricate and were lazy. And so you need someone to make the phone call. So an awful lot of these wound up being a phone call from a producer in BBC Radio 4. And it's like, we have a short story or from the Irish Times or whatever. And they're great because that gives you the impetus to write. I mean, writers are like school children doing their homework on a Sunday night late thing. You know? So you need that sort of deadline. You need that sort of request. But then you're because it's a commission, you are quite restricted on what you can do. So normally I'd wind up writing a story and the story would take legs and it would be like 4,500 words in the first draft, but it wouldn't be finished. But then I'd need to begin to cut and curl and kill off characters, a bit like the final act of a Shakespearean play, and get rid of a lot of people and get something that was 2,100 words for the BBC or maybe 2,500 words for a magazine or whatever. And so the stories were written, but they're never written to my satisfaction. And then in these long months of lockdown of this year, and having written all the novels I wanted to write for the meantime, I said, let's go back to the short stories. I always felt there was a book there, but this time I will write them purely for myself. And this time I will allow the characters in them to live and breathe and tell me their secrets and speak at length. And so some of the stories that were 2,000 words when broadcast on BBC Radio 4 wound up being like 9,000 words and 7,500 words, and the characters began doing things and they were liberated. They were sort of let loose. And so these aren't novels, but some of them are almost novella size. And it was fascinating it was lovely to write purely for myself. And so this book is like my little gift to myself. That doesn't presume that presumes that nobody else will ever read it, but my little gift to myself and a few other people who might read it, you know.
Mm-hmm. And the title, I suppose, is in the secret is in the title. You know, the theme is in the title. The Secrets Never Told, because they are all loosely about people who discover a secret that has maybe made them realize that their world, as they understood it now, no longer makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I was just thinking there about short stories. When we were at school, and I'm sure you read the same writers, the Sean of Whalon and Mary Lavin and Frank O'Connor, when you were studying at school, we were always told that a short story was a condensed form, a sort of a slice of life in which there's a truth is uncovered or there's an epiphany after which life will never be the same. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that definition?
Well, I never read that. I was actually in the classroom when the teacher was reading out that bit, but I think short stories do hinge on certain moments, and they allow you, it's sort of, as a novelist sees the whole world as somehow their terrain. And I remember like walking my dog in Drumcondra some years ago, and there was a skip on the side of outside the house. And normally skips are full of rubble, but this skip was full of paper, and it was all the stuff that had been left in the attic of this house. And I did what any respectable writer would do. I tied my dog to the skip at 2 o'clock in the morning, climbed in and read all the papers, and there were Valentine cards from 1950s and love letters from a young girl in 1950s and everything else. And I sort of knew that this was a play, and she was going to be 15 in the play, and she was going to die of TB, and it was only called April Brighton. I wrote a short poem in the skip. It was quite cold, so it was a very short poem. And but I sort of felt that story is a play. I wanted to be one day in the life of this girl, and I wanted to be where something else becomes a novel. And so certain things, these stories allowed me to hone in on certain themes I wanted to explore, certain notions of people understanding their lives and then not understanding their lives, without having to build the whole apparatus of a novel, without having to tell the entire story. And so I just found that these particular ideas, when they came to me, these characters belong to a short story, as against a novel, as against a play, as against a poem. And so really, I don't have any theoretical approach to these things. They are just certain characters suit certain forms, and these seem to work in short stories for me.
Mm. Well,
I think we did read the same. Did you read Exploring English by Gus Martin?
I don't think I can reveal that now, because I might be giving too much information about my age.
Well, you could have simply read the reprint, because it was people feel such nostalgia that they actually relaunched it as a gift before Christmas. And I wrote introduction, and I remember being 12 years of age, and I was going into secondary school, and I got a job as a van boy. You realize I'm going to wander around strange thoughts to this interview, but I got a job as an underage van boy for Pangrove ice cream, and I got my brother's copy of Exploring English, and there were two sets of names, and on the cover there was Led Zeppelin, and there was The Who, all these bands he was listening to, and then inside there was Mary Lavin and Frank O'Connor and sort of Ben McLaverty and Brian Free, and all these other names that opened up other worlds to me. And so the short story had a particular magic, because it was they were the first adult things I read.
Yes. Was there any particular story that you would remember there, Dermot, as being, very influential, shall we say, or something that really
well, Guess of the Nation is a magnificent story, and the last paragraph of Guess of the Nation is so powerful, and just the message of Guess of the Nation is so powerful. The Frank O'Connor story, which is I think a story that every school child should actually read, and obviously the Confirmation Soup by Brendan Behan was also very funny, and it was something that's funny. And for some ways, the album, there's a Mary Lavin one called, I think, The Tale of the Widow's Son, and what was interesting about it was that it had two endings. It had sort of, she was a widow, and she was working really hard to get her son through college, and the son cycling home, and there's one of the hens runs across the road, and the son actually skids to avoid the hen, and actually is killed, and everybody comes in, the neighbors. And then there's another version of the story where the son runs over the hen, and the mother goes demented, says, "I've been starving all my life, and you've no interest in the way I try to feed you." And the son is so upset, and that he leaves home. And so I love this, even though it's not her best story. It was very interesting in opening the possibilities, that the story doesn't necessarily have one ending, and then the story doesn't necessarily have one ending, it doesn't have one beginning either. And so it's just in terms of actually somebody playing with the form was interesting, in terms of just igniting the window of possibility in my mind.
The way that the Irish writers are always celebrated for being great short story writers, and I wondered how much of that do you think is due to the fact that we place a very high regard on someone who can tell a good story? We've a long tradition of oral storytelling.
I think we do place a high value on people who can tell a story. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember raconteurs like Mervyn Wall and Sidney Benton Smith. I remember when the Tyrone Guthrie Centre opened in Monaghan first, these old men were up there, and they'd be avoiding each other so they could save their best story for dinner. And it was quite a competition to tell who would tell the best story. These were men who told stories all their lives. And I think the Irish love to tell stories, and we find people who don't tell stories really, really strange. But I do think Ireland's relationship with the short story, people say, well, it's like the inner Russian coming out. I think a lot of it was to do with poverty. A lot of it was to do with the fact that Ireland didn't have indigenous publishing houses, or had very few indigenous publishing houses. If you go back into the 40s, into the 50s, you have the Bell magazine, you have Dolman Press starting up, then you have the 70s, and you actually have Gallery starting, and you have Neil Jordan and Des Hogan starting the Writers Cooperative, and myself starting Raven Arts Press, and loads of other people coming in, and suddenly, like, we took control of our own fiction, and also a lot of it was published abroad. But with censorship so fierce in Ireland, I think that the short story was one that writers could slip into without having been banned in the way that novels were banned. And so I think when I was growing up, there was always a thing that the short story was Ireland's national art form. And I said, hang on, but there's also, like, James Joyce wrote Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, and Beckett wrote that great trilogy of novels and sort of everything. So, but there was this sense that the short story was a safer form in a conservative society. So, and it's interesting the number of great Irish novels that begin as short stories, and then they expand out, from Lancashire Go Down, which began as a short story, and others. So I think that short stories suited the Irish temperament, but also suited the economic circumstances that you could have a short story published in the Bell magazine, and that they understood, because it was published in Ireland, they understood the society. Whereas if you wanted a novel published, you were going to England, you were going to New York, and very often you were dealing with people who didn't, with editors and publishers who didn't understand the society that the story had been written in, and who had preconceptions of that society. And if your story didn't fit into certain themes, it wasn't an Irish novel. So I think this short story was a very good stepping stone. And that is not to denigrate it, because obviously people like Colm Tóibín and Anne Enright and so many others have done very successful with novels and then gone back into the short story, because it has unique things about it that make it very, very special.
And you yourself have written across all the genres, all the platforms. You've written plays, you've written novels, you've written poetry. Is there any particular genre that you find easiest, or more that you feel most at home in, shall we say?
It's the odd thing that when you begin with poetry, it's still the one, like, the poetry is like the 100-meter sprint in the Olympics, and it's sort of that blue ribbon event, and the novel is like the marathon. So there's a sense of achievement in finishing a novel. I remember, like, loads of people want to write novels and just never get to the end. I remember getting a phone call from a friend, and she was in a cottage in County Clare, and she said, I just can't finish this novel. I cannot finish this novel, you know. And I said two things. I said, firstly, everybody who rides the Tour de France and gets through it, because every day, if you're an hour late, you're expelled from the Tour de France. If you fall and can't get up, you're expelled from the Tour de France. So just to get to the Champs-Élysées on the last day, you have won the Tour de France just by finishing the Tour de France. And if you finish your novel, you will have won the Tour de France. You will have ridden the Tour de France and succeeded and got to the end. So you must do it for yourself, so that you have done this achievement. And secondly, you just got paid $1 million by Penguin in America, and you don't want to give the $1 million back. And it was Nuala O'Phelan trying to finish her first novel. And even someone like that, who had success behind her, still had that same nerves that everybody else has facing a novel. And when you face a novel, my last novel, An Arc of Life, took me 13 years to write. And the one before that took around 11 years. Now, that doesn't mean I was at it consistently. It means that I threw it at the wall and abandoned it and forgot about it for long periods, because you literally, like a mountain runner, you're running into the wall and you find a way to push through the wall. So the novels are, there's a sense of achievement in finishing a novel because it's such a long slog. There's a sense of purity in finishing a poem, because the poems, novels are ground out on cold Tuesday afternoons, where you sort of go into a room and out of routine, you slowly begin to walk. So you're writing a novel, whereas the poems write you. You're walking in the park, you're walking your dog at night, and a sudden thought sparks with electricity. And you just know that's the opening line of a poem. And unless you write it down immediately, it will be gone. And so the poems are always a benediction and a surprise. And so there's always a specialness around them. And the plays are in between. Picasso was once asked, when was a painting finished? And he said, when the gentleman from the gallery comes to hang it. And the play is only really finished when the gentlemen and ladies from the press come to hang the playwright. And so it's perpetually changing. And you're also dealing with sort of actors who might want to change lines or mightn't know their lines, or you're dealing with all these sort of things. And there is a great immediacy to it. It's hard in this sense of lockdown to know that this time last year, I had a play on in the Abbey Theatre, and it was sold out, and it was like there were 440 people in every night, and many from Dockland communities who hadn't been in the theatre very often, and sometimes they were there drinking till 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's funny how the world has changed, that you just can't imagine 440 people in a theatre, but there is that sense of with a play. If you go in, you actually meet the audience, or you can overhear the audience talking at the interval, and you get that sense of immediacy. With a novel, because they are big events, you might get reviews within a week or two and get a sense of reaction. With poems, it's like dropping a stone down a well, and you've no idea if you will ever hear the splash.
I was just thinking there when you mentioned about poetry, that while there's the sort of the group dynamic involved in people coming to a play, there's also, I suppose, the shared experience of poetry at a time. You mentioned there the lockdown, and I was thinking of how during the lockdown in Ireland, poetry became very important. And I'm thinking in particular of how President Michael G. Higgins' poem, Take Care, became very symbolic for people. So I was just thinking there about poetry being both very personal and also kind of universal, you know, the shared experience.
That is the other thing. I mean, Nadeshda Mandelstam, Osip Mandelstam's wife, in one of her books and memoirs, said that like a poet could spend 60 years of his or her life writing poems every day and sort of producing volume after volume. And if they were lucky, they'd be remembered for one poem or one stanza or one line of one poem. And that's how poetry gets condensed down. But those poems that do strike a chord do live on. And so if I'm remembered for anything, I know it ever will be, I expect it will be for some poem, and probably for a poem that I don't even rate very highly, but because I think poems they go on very, very strange journeys. And so I find as somebody who has starting to look the free travel pass in the face as we speak, and looking back over 45 years of writing, what surprises me is a number of people who remember certain poems by me, and how those poems have meant something to them. And that has been, I mean, somebody wrote to me, and there's a certain poem of mine they put up on the mantelpiece every Christmas Eve. I was amazed. It was in one of the newspapers. They could have from a newspaper. Probably the nicest thing that ever happened to me was when the Ballymun flats were torn down, the high-rise towers in Dublin. Somebody who was a documentary maker sent me a photograph, and they were up on a crane, and on like the 7th or 8th story of a tower block, like 3 walls were knocked down, and there was one wall left, and there was a mock fireplace had been put in because there weren't proper fireplaces there. And above the fireplace, somebody had left a poem of mine called Ballymun Incantation, and it was surrounded by pictures of their children. And when they left the flat, this was the last thing they did, and they left it there, and it was just this one wall standing there. So poems affect people in ways that you can't. You don't know who will be affected by poems. So, and I think in lockdown, I think because it's so hard. Thankfully, I'm not in the middle of a novel, because if you're writing a contemporary novel, the world has changed so much that it's very hard to finish that novel. It's very hard to know what life is going to be like in 6 months, and 18 months, and 2.5 years time. I had this with a novel of mine called Tanglewood some years ago, which was set at the height of the Celtic Tiger, and was written at the height of the Celtic Tiger, initially about 2 neighbours building a house, a shared house in the back garden to sell. But then, of course, the property market collapsed, and I realized that the world I was writing about had disappeared. And it took me 10 or 11 years to finish that book. And then I realized that I didn't need to explain the whole collapse of the Celtic Tiger. If you were a novelist, and if you wrote a novel set in the summer of 1913, and it was a long, glorious summer, you didn't need to tell the reader what was going to happen next, because the reader knew what was going to happen next. But I almost had to wait until the Celtic Tiger became part of history before I could go back and finish that novel. And so I think that people in the middle of writing novels at the moment must be stuck in a terrible quandary if their novels are in the present world, because the present world doesn't make sense. Whereas poetry has the freedom, it deals with emotions and immediacy, and you can write a poem now that will hopefully reflect this time, but will still be valid in 20, 30, 40 years' time.
I was wondering, Dermot, if you'd mind actually reading one of your poems and tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, just like all poets, I just happen to have a copy of a book beside me. It's by sheer fluke, and this poem is called Temple Street Children's Hospital. And as a child, I had a very bad stammer, and I was singly unable to say 66 sneaky silvery snakes. And the stammer is, it's like a prophecy in reverse, because it tells you what's going to happen 10 minutes after it has already happened. And as a child, I was quite bullied and called a dunce, and quite, there was no great understanding of what a stammer was, or why someone would have a stammer. And so my mother brought me to see a speech therapist in Temple Street Children's Hospital. And poems happen. It was, my mother died when I was quite young, and so one of the last memories is of being with her and walking into this small hospital. And I was walking past the hospital one day some years ago, and the mother and child were coming out, and immediately I had that sort of flashback to that moment. And so it's a very simple poem called Temple Street Children's Hospital, from my mother. This is your territory. I brought you here. Shoddy tenement windows were washing flaps, crumbling lanes where cars get broken for parts. There is an archway beneath which we passed, like the one above which you shared a flat, with your sisters up from Monaghan for walk in a war-becalmed Dublin. Surely you must once have gazed up, puzzled by how the years since had landed you here with a son, a stuttering misfit, unable to pronounce the most simple of words, a bright penny whose cloud you'd never see lift as you fretted, unaware of how close death hovered. The speech therapist's office had fancy ties and books, and a special mirror which allowed me to be watched. The waiting room contained a white, merciless clock which ticked off the final hours we spent alone, gazing down at a garden where I yearned to walk, trapped indoors by the shame of my garbled tongue. I stand outside that hospital in Nerney's Court, at Kelly's Row, where a blacksmith once worked, and no logic can explain why you feel this close, why I see us in the mother and child who pass, or how, as I age, I slowly become your son, gazing through your eyes with incomprehension. I was too young to have known you, so it makes no sense that every passing year only deepens your absence. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the start of speech therapy training in Ireland. And I read this poem at a conference of speech therapists of a certain age. And when I came to the line, and a special mirror which allowed me to be watched, the whole room collapsed in hysterical giggles, because they all remembered this particular room at this time I did it. So it's strange how you can read a poem 200 times, and on the 200th time you get a different reaction.
Well, it's a beautiful poem, Dermot. Thank you very much for reading it. You mentioned there about losing your mother when you were young, and I believe your father was away a lot. He was away at sea, isn't that right? And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about your childhood growing up, and how you actually started off becoming a writer.
Well, everybody only has one childhood, so every childhood is normal to them. My mother died when I was 10 years of age, just before Christmas. Again, children didn't know about these things. You weren't told that I was in Newfoundland Hospital. I didn't know that she was ill, and suddenly it was quite a shock to me. My father was a sailor, and he was at sea most of the time. I had three siblings. My eldest was June Considine, who is a very, very fine, accomplished novelist under her own name, and more recent years as Laura Elliott, where she sells books all over the world, ebooks, and does really, really well. But June actually left school when she was around 15, as girls her age and boys her age, of what class did at that time, and had dreams of blank sheets of paper, and didn't do anything about it until she was in her 30s. I'll come to that in a moment, but I used to walk to school with a guy called David. David was going to be a soldier and shoot people. As we were going to join the Irish Army, I'm not sure who he was going to shoot, because the Irish Army had been primarily involved in peacekeeping for all of its existence. But one day I had a teacher called Michael Donnelly in primary school, and one day he read a poem, Honing Lung of Valparaiso, the poem by Monsignor Padraig de Bruin, which was and it was like the classroom was in black and white and this poem was in colour, and it was a new way of seeing the world, and I was mesmerised and fascinated. And when I walked home, I decided that I was going to be a poet as well, and told it to David. And David said, "You can't be a poet. Because to be a poet, you have to go to university." And we didn't know anybody who'd been to university. Now, the chemist's son around the corner wound up being knighted by the Queen of England for his work in sort of medical science. And the girl I used to play with became a doctor. And so loads of people, you could go on, but at that time, we were the first generation to have free second level education. Like I was the second person in my family to do the Leaving Cert. And so there was that sense of we didn't understand the horizons that were there. But as I say, I left school early and got a job as an underage van by Pangrove. And that's summer I began to write down words, but I didn't know what they were. It was just a journey for me into words. I was fascinated by words. And when I went to secondary school, and teachers are so important. There's a teacher called Colin Hewitt, and he came in, he had a black bag with him, like a doctor's bag, and he had two things in the bag. He took out a leather strap. It was his first day as a teacher. He took out a leather strap, and he said, "They gave me this to beat us up with on the way in. Will someone please put it in the bin?" And he took out a book called The Hobbit. This is about a small furry creature called the Hobbit who lives in a hole in the ground. And we all said, "Sir, sir, 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 sir." And he said, "What?" He said, "Like, we're all hard-charts from fingers. Could you read about something else, not some creature living in a hole in the ground?" And he said, "Shut up and listen." And we all shut up, we all listened. We all fell in love with Bilbo Baggins. Within 2 weeks, we all wanted to have Bilbo Baggins as baby. And I trusted this guy, and I showed him these poems. But and he said, "These are great poems." But I said, "I can't be a poet, because to be a poet, you have to go to university." He said, "All you need is a pen and paper and the freedom of your imagination." And so I began to write poems, but I had no notion that a small mobile library came to Finglas, and all the poetry books were from the 19th century, or with a Celtic tiger, Celtic twilight. They all had like long flowing hair and big sticky bows. I mean, like the normal standard dress was skinhead and Finglas. So I thought I'd never be a poet. I'd never been able to get the fashion accessories for a start. And I wrote poems about the Celtic twilight. I went to Wicklow and looked at cows and fields and fairy forts. And my sister June saw that there was a writer's workshop in the People's College. The People's College was set up by the trade unions for adult education after the war. John Charles Macquarie, the Archbishop of Dublin, was suspicious of it. Anything John Charles Macquarie was suspicious of was a good thing. So we went to it, and June began to write. We had two lecturers, and they weren't lecturers, they just talked to us. One was Sean McCann, who was the father of Colin McCann, who was great just in the joys of ordinary journalism. And I'm a journalist as well, and I take great pride in my journalism. And then the other was Anthony Cronin, that great poet who didn't look like a poet at all. And he wised me up, and he said, like, "These poems are very, very good, but why are they about all these old-fashioned, archaic subjects?" And I said, "Well, that's what poetry is about." And he said, "Everything within the ambit of human experience is within the ambit of the poet. Go and write about what you know." And so I began to write. But also I found that at the time, very little of my world was reflected in Irish poetry. And there are two types of poets. There are practical and impractical poets. Now, if you can be an impractical poet, it is really useful, because people will make you tea, open doors for you, give you meals, everything else. If you're a practical poet, you have to go and do things. Tony didn't explain this to me, so I became a practical poet. At the age of 18, there was a guy a few streets away who printed football pools, coupons in his shed in his back garden. And I got him to begin to print poetry books, and Raven Arts Press was born. And suddenly, as against just publishing my own work, I was publishing a new generation of poets like Matthew Sweeney and Michael Loughlin and Philip Casey and Sarah Berkeley and Rosita Boland and people like Paul Duggan, who had no publishers, and Michael Hartnett and all kinds of writers, and suddenly first translations of Newland Legolan into English and all these things. And it was this journey that it was just part and parcel of the whole thing. Yeats had the thing, and I'm not even comparing myself to Yeats, because you couldn't do that, but he had this thing that you had to not only create a literature, but create an audience. And so Raven Arts Press and things like the Irish Arts Cooperative and all the things that were happening in music at that time in the late 70s in Ireland, with sort of the Boomtown Rats and the Radiators from Space and sort of U2 and all those bands. It was about creating an audience. I think it was that first generation to get free second level education. And meant them when I middle class lads like you two who would have got education anyway, but there was suddenly there was an audience, and were people like Finn O'Toole and everything else who were suddenly asking questions, and it was a really interesting time, and lots of interesting magazines and things came out of it, and it was a really fascinating time to become a writer. But at the time we really felt we needed to also take control of the means of production, and that's what Raven Arts was. It was a press famous for its dissidents and its misprints.
Well, you were very young actually when you started off the Raven Arts Press. I mean, you were only what, 18 or 19, am I right?
Yeah.
So that was, I mean, it must have been very exciting, but also, I mean, how did you suddenly plunge into being a publisher? Where did you get the money from? How did it kind of all pan out?
It all panned out by accident, which is the way that you discover most things, from penicillin to sex. It's sort of we didn't really know what we were doing, and that was part. But also in the bands were starting up who couldn't play instruments, so it wasn't that difficult that poets who knew about publishing began to publish. I remember I was laying out our first book in a flat in Dolphin's Ban, and skinheads thought that we were drug dealers and were trying to kick down the front door, and the only drug we had was cow gum for actually pasting the pages down. And we went to in 1979 the Pope came to Ireland, and he was a great patron of the arts, because every Marxist and Maoist student in Trinity College in UCD became a capitalist overnight, because we money made selling Pope posters, and every house in Ireland had a picture of a Pope, and every student was selling Pope posters. And we laid out that book in Dolphin's Ban, and we came to a back street printer in Rathmines, and he took a look at it and he says, not another bloody Pope poster. And we said, no, it's a book of poems. He says, okay, I'll print it for free. And we looked around,
Really?
and there were thousands of popes all drying on the walls. He printed it for free. We actually bought it on the wheels of our bicycles to another flat. We collated the pages by hand. We brought it to a bookbinder who did it for next to nothing. And without knowing anything, we began to sell it around pubs and in bookshops. And really, we just felt that there was a need for voices to be heard. And we didn't go into it. It was never business. It was a loose movement for change. And then after 10 or 12 years, Irish writing had moved on, and I stopped Raven Arts Press, and I co-founded New Ireland Books. And the idea with New Ireland Books was that I'd be involved in founding, and then I would retreat further and further into the background, because when I was published by Penguin and people like in England for the first time, I found it quite interesting how you had an editor. An editor had great control and great authority, and was like a god figure. And then after around 4 years, he or she would go back to his desk at 10 to 5 on a Friday evening, and they'd find a severance check and all their belongings in a plastic bag, and they'd be kicked out, like football managers, and they'd bring somebody else in. And that's how big publishers in England renewed themselves, by having new people coming in the whole time. And I realized I didn't want to be in control of the same publishing house that I founded 50 years ago, 50 years ago. And so it was, I think that was important to relinquish control, but keep the ethos of being a press for writers. And since then, like, New Ireland has gone from strength to strength, and like every 3 or 4 years, a new editor comes in with new ideas and new writers. And I think that it renews itself, and I think that's very important. So I stay in the background. I think I might be called editor emeritus or something, but I'm like Tom Hagen in The Godfather. I'm the consigliere. They phone me up when somebody needs to be shot.
I was interested actually in the whole idea that that you were a publisher and a writer, because I wondered how you would compartmentalize the two, but I see what you're saying is that you've moved back now into that editor-at-large role. But I wonder,
when Johnny Home was published by Penguin and took off and became a very controversial book and everything else, it just became impossible. The balance became impossible to control. So early on, it wasn't that difficult. But in 1988, the Johnny Home was published, 89, and then 88, Raven Arts published The Godscrab of Paddy Doyle, a really, really important book. It was the first book about childhood abuse in institutions, and it changed Ireland. And suddenly I realized that these are I also got married, and I wanted a life of my own, and it just became I realized that I couldn't be all things to all people, So that was the point when I moved apart,
And in terms of the sort of books that come into your publishing company today, do you at any stage get involved? Does somebody come to you, one of the editors come to you and say, I think I've got a cracker here, or, you know, what do you read any of the submissions that come in? If somebody says, I've got something really good by somebody really young and new and unheard of?
I'm like a grandfather, and grandfathers and grandmothers learn not to give advice. So basically, I'm at the end of the phone if something arises, if something, if it's particularly things with libel and things as well, have a very, you know, you really get a sense of it, or if people are uncertain. So if somebody seeks my advice, I'll give my advice, but I'm not involved in day-to-day decisions in the company. I'm not involved in accepting or rejecting anybody. But if somebody is unsure about something and wants my advice, I will give my advice, but that advice mightn't be acted upon.
And what do you think yourself makes a good book? If you even talk to people about books and in the way that people do, some people find the plot more important. Other people find, you know, they get engaged with the characters, or they don't like the characters, or whatever. I mean, what do you think makes a good read?
I think a good book is a book that has an engine of curiosity inside it. And I think that's very important early on in the book. And if I don't teach creative writing, I don't know how you could, but I'm occasionally I would talk to people, you know, young or something else, and I'll say that the opening of a short story, the opening of a novel, is almost when you're walking your dog at night and you're walking down a quiet road and all the curtains are pulled except for one house, and you look in the window, and we're natural voyeurs, and we begin to speculate on who actually lives in that house based on what we can see in the window, whether it has wallpaper or whether it has paintings, big television, whether it has bookcases, all those sort of things. We begin to form a thing. And the opening page of a novel or short story is like that. We have to begin to speculate. We don't necessarily have to like the people, but we have to be curious about it. We have to have sufficient curiosity to turn the page. And I think that sort of a good book is something that engages us. And they often don't have big plots. I mean, The God Squad was the biggest selling book that Raven published. The biggest selling book that New Ireland published ever was probably I Use Somebody by Nuala O'Phelan. I remember being involved with Edwin Hegel in the decision as to whether to print 2,000 or 2,500 copies. We really weren't sure. And then she was on the Late Late Show, and she just did this brilliant interview, and I just phoned Edwin at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I said, reprint, even though I wasn't involved. But you just knew that Nuala had touched a chord with so many people. And there was nothing in reading the manuscript, you say, there's nothing here that is remarkable. I mean, her life was remarkable. She was a remarkable person. But there was nothing here that you think this book is going to wind up being #2 in the New York Times bestsellers. But she was just honest about herself, honest about her life, honest about the onset of middle age, honest about loneliness, honest about sexual frustration at times, honest about the ordinary, the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, as Yeats would say. And people all over the world picked up that book and felt that they recognized themselves in the book, and the book took off and sold in various languages. And that's something that you can't teach, or that's something that you can't, that was her lived life, was sort of there. And so as a publisher, it's very difficult, because many books I've seen come in and I said, this book is going to take off, it has a brilliant plot, has this, that, and the other, but it's that human connection. And I think the human connection is what, and I always also think books can also be marketed in certain ways. Books can have a second life. I mean, there's a book called Love in Black and White. I don't know, have you ever heard of it? It came out, it didn't do well. You'd have found it in remainder bookshops for 50 cents or 50 pence for a long time. And after a few years, the publisher said, it's about a photographer who photographs bridges, and he falls in love, and that's why it's called Love in Black and White. They said, maybe the title's wrong, maybe we should call it The Bridges of Madison County. And suddenly this book takes off again in book clubs and word of mouth. And so books can have curious journeys, and sometimes but I think that one of the great tragedies nowadays, when Raven Arts began, we were a really small press. The books were quite badly produced, but they got reviewed. They got 10, 12 reviews, and they were there in the bookshops for 6 months. Nowadays, if a book hasn't taken off in 2 or 3 weeks, it's already making its way down the back of the bookshop, and soon it's gone back to the publisher within 3 months. And those books have less time to make for word of mouth to become cult books. And I think that that's a pity. That in some ways it's great that so many books have been published, but I think that the whole book selling world has become such a strange world that unless a book is sort of marketed a certain way, those random things are harder to actually happen. But the books that have been great successes have been books that when I read them initially, I didn't think they were going to do any particular great business.
Yes, that's true. Their business has changed. Of course, marketing, is a big part of it. And even for a writer, marketing yourself and having to, do the circuit. There's no circuit at the moment, but that's much more a part of it now, isn't it? I think I read somewhere that there were 600 books published on one day there a couple of weeks ago. 600 books in one day were published. So it can't always be. Pardon? 601.
601, actually.
I think you beat them to it. I was just thinking there about some of the writers that you have published who've actually moved away from Ireland. Now, you have stayed in Ireland, you've written about your own community, you've written about the Anglo-Irish community, you've written about all sorts of layers of Irish society. But some Irish writers prefer or feel that they have to move away, and it gives them a different perspective, or it gives them an international perspective, whatever. We could think there, of course, of James Joyce himself. But I just wondered, how has it been different for you, do you think, and how is it actually staying at home and reflecting the society?
That mistake of becoming a practical poet at the age of 18, which was a terrible decision on my life, because basically I was the boy left manning the shop while everybody else went abroad. I was probably the only member of my generation not to live outside Ireland for long periods, and they all often had great adventures in various places, and I was at home publishing the books and sort of dealing with dodgy bookbinders and sort of and those things. I think that people like Joyce had to go abroad, and Beckett had to go abroad to find the space. And I think that sort of, with my generation, it was a case of actually, I want to explore this country, understand this country. And it just didn't suit me to go abroad. It wasn't, I lead a very, very non-literary life. I mean, it would have been nice to have gone abroad, but I wouldn't have been able to play football every Friday night with my mates from Finglas if I actually had. I wouldn't be able do all these things that I did. And Dublin is it's a good city in the sense that it has a number of theatres very, very close together. I'm 10 minutes from the Abbey Theatre, I'm 10 minutes from the Gate Theatre, I'm 10 minutes from the Project Art Centre, I'm 10 minutes from the wilderness of Bull Island, and until planes stopped flying a few months ago, I was like an hour from London and everything else. And I actually really felt that I wanted to explore that sort of world, but then I never felt constricted by that. And so novels like The Family in Paradise Pier and Arc of Life, these are two novels about the Gould Verschoyle family, and they're also set in Moscow in the 1930s. They're set in gulags, they're set in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, and London during the 1926 general strike. And I think that one of my favorite of my more recent novels is a novel called The Lonely Sea and Sky, about my father's voyages to Lisbon. And I spent like 6 months with 2 maps of sitting here in this room. My son is 6'7", so he's a very large bicycle he wasn't using. And on one bicycle, there was a map of Lisbon in 1940. And over here, there's a map of Lisbon now. So I knew Lisbon now, and I was trying to walk out the bits. And just, you spend a lot of time traveling in your imagination. So I think certain writers do need to go to the places they're writing about, and certain writers just sit at home and write. So I feel I have traveled an awful lot in my imagination. It's just that I haven't actually traveled an awful lot. I haven't felt the necessity to go abroad to find a mental space to write.
But did you find, or do you feel that it's important for an Irish writer to reflect back the society that lives in, that they live in?
I think it is important.
What I mean is that you were one of the first people to write about the working class community of North Dublin. for example. But then you also wrote about an Anglo-Irish family growing up in Donegal who went, who took on communism and went off and had tragic, endings. So are you trying to deliver sort of different kind of experiences or observations, shall we say, of the different layers of Irish society to people who might not have had any experience of them?
I'm trying to understand the society I come from myself. And I'm always interested in people on the margins. And so I felt I grew up on the margins in that the world I grew up in was sort of, wasn't written about. But that said, it was a new world. And so you couldn't expect Joyce or Bean could have written about it because actually he was actually from the suburbs. He moved out there very quickly, but sort of he preferred the world of the tenement slums of his childhood to actually sort of as his terrain. He didn't want to address that world of Crumlin where his family lived. But I sort of felt I want to understand the totality of the society I came from. And people like the Gulver Shiles were also on the edge of society. They were home rulers, they were liberal Protestants. They were looking for, Countess Markovich was a relation, but also they had relations who were like staunch Orangemen. And so I love the contradictions within every Irish family. And I loved it. I mean, Hugo Hamilton is brilliant with that, with The Sailor and the Wardrobe and those novels about his Gaeilgeoir father and his grandfather who was in the British Navy. And so I actually felt, for me, there was no difference writing about the factory workers in Finglas or writing about the Gulver Shiles in Moscow. They were all part of the same story in the same way. I suppose because my mother was from a family of 11, my father was from a family of 7, and they all emigrated to England for work. I have relations, I have 1 or 2 relations in Ireland, but my relations are primarily in Wolverhampton, in Leicester, in Luton, in Coventry, spread across England. And the only reason that I have a Dublin accent as against a London accent or a Leicester or Wolverhampton accent is that my father was a sailor and emigrated twice a week for 44 years. And so when I also wrote about soccer, I wrote about the Irish immigrant experience through soccer in 2 plays in High Germany and the Parking Glass. And when I was in Germany in 1988, watching that Irish soccer team and half my born in England and everything else, for me, they weren't mercenaries or they weren't, for me, they were the sons of my aunts and my uncles. And they were as much part of the Irish experience of somebody growing up in Finglas or growing up in Donnybrook or growing up in Mayo. And so the Irish experience for me has always been as much about the Irish experience of Japan as the Irish experience of Kildare. It is, one is cognizant that we're a nation who, particularly in my parents' generation, and not so much my generation, but the generation came after, had to emigrate and had to become part of. So there's always, if you tell the Irish story, there is no part of the world that you cannot go to, and that cannot be part of the Irish story because they're all interlinked and all full of contradictions. And writers love contradictions. It's from contradictions that sort of stories come.
I was just going to ask you there how you spent the last 6 months in lockdown. Were there any books that you read that were, consolation to you, shall we say, if you were at home? Were you at home on your own, or?
My son, I have 2 sons, one in London that I haven't seen since Christmas. I'm hoping to see at Christmas this time, and one son living with me. And I actually went back to writing poems for the first time. Found in those long winter evenings, I began, and long summer evenings, I beg pardon, I began to walk the streets again, like when I was 16 as a child, and poems came to me, and I found that was a great benediction. Finishing these short stories gave me a focus for Secrets Never Told. I mean, the thing of Secrets Never Told probably won't do very well because it's coming out in this massive explosion of books. But I've written 14 novels and I had plays and everything else. I felt really sorry for writers who are for first-time writers. There is a writer called Marion Lee who wrote a book called A Quiet Tide about a botanist, Ellen Hutchins, in the start of the 19th century in Bantry, who was, her family made her live there. She was trapped by her family, trapped by society, and yet she was a fiercely independent woman, and she's now a famous botanist. And this Marion Lee must have spent like 5 years writing this beautiful book. And like same way when you read David Park for the first time, you said, this is a true writer. And it must be so hard for those writers who've spent years working towards a debut, and then that debut goes into suddenly within 2 weeks of that book being published, there wasn't a bookshop open in Dublin. I think books upstairs were sort of operating behind closed doors and everything else. So it's I've been lucky in that I've actually had my time. Hopefully I have a bit of time to go, but I felt so I spent the time writing, but also I felt time feeling really, really sorry for writers who were just about to publish their first book and had spent so long imagining I signed book launches were always great fun. The first Raven book launch happened in the Protestant church in Finglas, and it was really funny because the literati from Dublin came out and they were terrified to come to Finglas, so they all drank fire water and they all were fighting and rowing in the church while the locals were looking at them aghast. I thought it was hard to bring art to the people, but I realised it was really hard to protect the people from the artists on that occasion. And book launches were great fun and everybody got together. And last week the publishers in New Ireland brought over 50 copies of Secrets Never Told that people had requested, and I did my book launch on the bonnet of my 15-year-old clapped Skoda, signing books on the car, and that was the book launch because there'll never be a gathering of people. So I feel sorry for writers who are missing for the first time all of these things that they imagined of how a book would be. But when a book is published, it's never like you imagined. Winston Churchill said many wise things, and one thing he said was that no battle plan ever survived the word charge, and no book in the same way is ever quite the same way. So I've been lucky that I've had a lot of decades of success and failure, but to experience all those things, and I feel sorry for writers who haven't.
Dermot, thank you very much for talking to us tonight, and I do hope that you'll come and see us if you do manage to get over to London. I hope you will, and we'll certainly try and put together some sort of a launch for you for Secrets Never Told, which is a great book, and I think a lot of people will really enjoy it. And thank you very much for talking to us.
The pleasure of your company and your conversation. It will be a pleasure to be in Hammersmith. At my age, it will be a pleasure to be anywhere. And thank you also to the London, to the Irish Culture Centre for putting together such an important programme of events and keeping writers in contact with their readers and their audience at this time. So it's been a pleasure to be involved in this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dermot.